Oops, I think I have to give you permission. Make a co-host. There you go.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. So yeah, today I just wanted to, sorry about that. Today I just wanted to share a little bit about my work and just sort of my creative practice generally through the thread of Ikebana, which is Japanese floral design. You can see that I have kind of the remnants of an arrangement over here. This is something that I've been actively studying since 2017. And I think studying Ikebana has just really shown me how to rethink other creative disciplines or practices. So I just wanted to share a little bit first about what I do during the day as an interaction product designer, and then share a little bit about my art and Ikebana and how it's kind of bled into other areas. So really, this is Ikebana tips for software design, but I think a more accurate name is like Ikebana tips for anything, basically. So like I mentioned before, I'm a designer by day. In my spare time, I'm also an artist and a floral designer. And I've always sort of just like had this identity crisis where I felt like my life was super bifurcated. I had product design during the day, really deep in the tech scene, living in San Francisco, growing up in the Bay Area. That was like kind of my whole life. And then I felt like as soon as I put the laptop away or got on the tech bus to go back and forth on my commute, then like nights and weekends were spent just making art and just being in this whole other world that I felt like had nothing to do with my primary activity at work. So I guess I'll go into a little bit of detail about sort of what my 9 to 5 looked like. I spent most of my career so far at Apple, where I was on the design team for Keynote Pages and Numbers, or the whole suite together is called iWork. And I worked there from 2015 to the beginning of 2020. My role there was to be the design lead of Pages. And it was cool because I was responsible for designing across the Mac, iOS, iPad OS, which is a little bit newer, and our web application. And aside from designing features that worked across all devices, which was sort of a fun systems problem in and of itself, I was also responsible for the word processing or text handling features across Keynote, Pages, and Numbers, and then similarly across all devices on those things. So it was very challenging just going out of school and directly into that, because I think for those of you who might be familiar with the app, Pages is a word processing application, but it's always maybe had a little bit of an identity crisis where it was sort of in this weird spot where we have competitors that are super well known, like Microsoft Office and Google Docs, and they have distinct advantages over the iWork suite and Pages in particular. Word is super fully featured. They've just been adding more and more to the product as the years have gone on, and they have anything you could possibly want, even if it's extremely niche. And then Google Docs, on the other hand, just really nailed collaboration. Like, even though iWork had a lot of the same collaboration features as Google Docs, we sort of had a PR crisis where like not a lot of people knew that those features existed. So the bulk of my work at Apple was really just trying to figure out like what should Pages do, because it was just kind of unclear. Like, what Pages has always been good at historically was making really beautiful documents that no one else could. Like, it really sort of had like the Apple design touch, and a lot of oh okay a lot of the design work was also kind of strategic. So I was trying to formulate a new direction for the app, and where we landed was on digital books. Mainly doubling down on the strength that we already had, which was making beautiful documents, but trying to add a twist where maybe they were I guess, natively digital. Even though Google Docs is a web app, I feel like a lot of the features are very print oriented still, and Microsoft Word is still super print oriented. So a lot of my work in those 5 years was really just pivoting to this new direction and making Pages an ebook maker, which I felt like was a really unique strength that no one else was able to share. Oh. So the span of my work just really took like all corners of the app, anything from redesigning the entry point across all 3 of the apps, Pages, Keynote, and Numbers, as well as thinking about the different use cases and types of documents people would want to make. So I had a hand in shaping, do we think that independent authors want to write a novel? And like, what type of novel should it be? Should it be like a romance novel or a horror novel? Should people try to make textbooks? Since Apple, operating within the Apple ecosystem, you also had to consider legacy applications like iBooks Author, which was essentially a digital textbook maker that's now been end of lifed, which I feel a little bit bad about, killing another app, but hopefully we like accommodated the use cases in the education space fairly well. And just thinking about like, sure, there's the education bent and accommodating for iBooks Author users, but we also should think consumer minded as well. So developing templates and features that, you know, support things like cookbooks, for example. And aside from just thinking about the types of use cases and books that we wanted to encourage people to make, I was also responsible for handling all of the editing features within the app. So essentially everything that's in the sidebar over here, and kind of like the Chrome all around the UI. So, you know, how do you edit a text box? How do you represent spreads? So it was kind of a mix of just like harkening back to more print oriented media so that things could be printed if they wanted to, but also have digitally focused features. And then, like I mentioned before, a large part of the role too was translating those designs across different device sizes. So if I felt like I had a design pretty solid on the Mac, just needing to make sure that those same types of editing properties were equally usable on a smaller screen size. So here's an example of the text inspector or sidebar on the Mac, and then how it translates to the phone, just using whatever UI is contextually appropriate. And going end to end was super fun, you know, thinking about like, what is the process like of creating a new document? How do you edit it? And then also just having a little bit of a hand in how is it represented to the broader community. So one of my last initiatives at Apple was helping on Apple Books for Authors, which was really focused on independent authors and educators and trying to get them interested in publishing on Apple versus like Amazon or on Kindle or the Nook and Kobo and other sort of digital first publishing platforms. And I designed a wide range of features while I was there. A lot of them, basically in support of this kind of book publishing initiative. So it was really fun to be able to think sort of high and low at the same time, like what is the strategic direction of the app, but then what are the features needed in order to get there. But I left Apple in early 2020. And then after that, I joined Figma and I worked all of 2020 at Figma. Unfortunately, I can't really share what I did there because it hasn't been released yet, but it should be released probably in the next month or two. I will say that I worked on some mobile stuff, but that's about, I think, all I can disclose. And then more recently, I joined Muse, which is why I moved to New York from San Francisco. Our office is in Brooklyn, and it's great being a short walk from work when I can actually go back into the office again. But Muse is great. I think that it's the most consumer-oriented app that I've ever worked on. And there's just like such a wide variety of use cases. But at its core, it's just really like an expressive communication tool where you have a free canvas and you can kind of add whatever media you want, either by yourself and sort of kind of have like an indie blog or with friends too. I've been blogging on it a little bit and then forwarding one of my domains to it. So you can always check out Katherine.land and then see what I've been up to. But yeah, like it wasn't until a few months ago that I realized that there's been this extremely obvious through line throughout my professional career, which is just working essentially on Canvas-based tools. And I just really like this conversation that happens in the design where, I'm designing maybe the Chrome, like the sidebar and the editing features and like how you get into the app. But I feel like there's this beautiful complement where users are designing the stuff that's in the middle, like the meat of the product in a lot of ways. Like, they're building entire worlds just using the limitations that you set up as the app designer. And I think that framing things in that way simultaneously makes me more accountable to be empathetic towards users, but also sort of takes the pressure off in a way where I don't have to have all the answers. I need to just really be in tune with users and talk to them and not have an ego about it and just constantly be surprised. People have made things I never would have dreamed of in the apps that I've worked on. Like this is a choose your own adventure book that someone made in Keynote, which I thought was just like genius, being able to skip around different slides and audio effects and animations and transitions and stuff. I've seen tons of people play games in Figma, which I think especially this year has like really brought people together where Figma is almost kind of like the watering hole where people hang out and have fun, even though it's like technically the most work-oriented product I've ever worked on. And then in Muse too, like people are just making really beautiful art and sending messages to each other and well wishes. And I just think that this type of, I don't know, sort of open-ended dialogue is like really incredible, where you just set the constraints and then you're surprised by what happens. And I have no idea how people are going to use anything that I design. And I think that that's a lot of the fun. Yeah. And I think that I kind of treat the work that I do outside of product design sort of in that same way too, which I guess brings me to a little bit about my art practice. So yeah, I felt like historically there's always kind of been this bifurcation between what I do in my day job and then what I do outside of it, where, maybe I'm designing creation tools for other people during the day, but really like nights and weekends were all about using those tools to create something new. I'm really into the idea of world building. And I think that essentially software applications like Pages, Keynote, Numbers, Figma, Muse, they're all like canvases to world build as well. And I think that that's kind of fit in with how I think about my artistic practice as world building and almost kind of terraforming material. So I'll share some older pieces that I've made kind of from probably 2015 to 2017. And a lot of, I guess, in a nutshell, I make a lot of abstracted landscapes. This is probably familiar to a lot of people in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh has so many bridges. All of these photos were taken in Pittsburgh and then recompiled together. Same here. I'm really interested in this idea of taking something that is very familiar, like the bridge that you see every day or the landscape on your way to work, and then sort of reconfiguring them or recontextualizing them to be very new. So earlier in my practice, a lot of these landscapes were maybe a little more literal and then became a a little bit more removed or elevated from the content that I was directly taking, either, you know, with my camera or my phone, etc., and trying to think about the digital landscape being equally valid as the physical one. But I am really interested in this idea of sort of forming new worlds, whether that's like the software itself and setting the constraints for that, it's almost for like a biome to exist on the canvas. But I also really like cultivating new worlds or landscapes through kind of rudimentary material. This was a piece that I compiled together using photos of, I think this was a Kleenex tissue box. So I think I really like kind of honing in and then flipping something on its head and kind of building back out from these little fragments into a cohesive landscape or something that's maybe alluding to a larger world. Yeah, as time progressed, the work kind of just got more and more abstract. And similar to that vein, I guess, of world building. This is a still from a screenshot. I mean, sorry, a screensaver that I made. I made a series of 5 screensavers where I just really liked the idea of a screensaver sort of like being a portal to another place where maybe you're interacting with your laptop or your computer every day, but what if it suddenly like took you to somewhere that was a little unfamiliar? And then this was still from another screensaver that I made back in 2015. And the title of the series was called Parklets. I was really obsessed with the idea of just, yeah, San Francisco has a ton of aptly called parklets, tiny parks where you can hang out and just sit and enjoy yourself. So I wanted to carry that over in a way that was maybe digitally site specific. Yeah, and things just got more and more abstract. Like conversely, I was also making some prints and stuff, though I feel like a lot of my work is really digitally native. Creating kind of longer landscapes or things that are meant to be scrolled on the web. And here is kind of maybe a more literal interpretation of this idea of like terraforming and using this photographic material in a new way and recontextualizing it, as well as like forming objects, etc. But over time, I realized I was making less and less work. Like in 2015, when I first graduated from school, I still kind of had the urge to make things all the time. And then in 2016, you can see it like really dropped off. And I think real life and adjusting to my job and like the crazy commute I used to have and stuff really sunk in. And by 2017, 2018, I was basically making no work at all, which just made me super, super sad because I found making art to be really creatively fulfilling. And that's sort of what led me to start studying Ikebana. I really like Ikebana for a number of reasons, but I feel like a lot of the decisions in my life have just sort of come out of nowhere, where I just woke up one day and I was like, okay, I'm going to Google Ikebana classes in San Francisco. And I just ended up going with like the first teacher that I found essentially. And I had no idea what I was getting into, but I was like, I need a new hobby. I need accountability for making stuff. I'm just going to do Ikebana, without really thinking it through, which I think ultimately was a little beneficial because Ikebana provided a lot of the accountability I was looking for. A lot of people don't know this, but at least in Sogetsu Ikebana, the type of Ikebana that I studied, it's like the curriculum is fairly regimented. I have literal textbooks that I followed for the beginning arrangements that really cover like the basics of flower arranging, how to think about composition and sort of this 3-dimensional space, line, color, things I explored like in graphic design school, but newly about mass and material and space. So it was kind of nice to be challenged to think three-dimensionally, where so much of my life has been like making digital art or like having a graphic design background. I just wanted to share a little bit about the textbooks. It's kind of, yeah, there's definitions for how long certain stems in an arrangement should be, and there's kind of 3 primary stems that you work with. There's diagrams that show you the exact placement of each of those stems and how to think about things. And anytime you make an arrangement, your teacher needs to sign off on it. So basically, by studying these textbooks, you're agreeing to follow a curriculum that's set out. And then once you complete the curriculum, you get a certificate that shows that you did everything up to snuff, essentially. So this is me with my first Ikebana certificate. And there's like a whole identification number and like everything. So it's very structured, which I think gave me an excuse to kind of get out of myself, where if I didn't feel like making art, there was no one there to stop me, but there wasn't, yeah, there also like wasn't any guidance. So Ikebana kind of jump started being a little bit more disciplined, I think. Some of the beginning arrangements I made looked like this, where you can see the diagrams on the left and the actual arrangement on the right and kind of how they all fit together. And I did horizontal arrangements as well as vertically oriented arrangements. And you can, fundamentally, these arrangements are basically the same. You're using the same number of stems, the same number of flowers, but just changing the angle at which they're presented. And obviously like the type of flower, you know, a tulip versus a rose or whatever. But as you start studying, though, you get kind of more and more things unlocked. Like this is an arrangement that only uses flowers rather than having branches and flowers. Or this is one that's maybe at an unusual or kind of like provocative angle, where there's like there's a traditional focal point, like the roses in the middle, but there's also this sort of challenging focal point, which is that stem that's really coming off the edge of the vase and going towards the viewer. And by being so regimented earlier on in the practice, you really start to unlock these building blocks that you can then configure together into more interesting or compelling arrangements. This is an arrangement that is essentially 2 arrangements combined together. So each of them operates pretty well on its own, but then it formulates a whole nother arrangement when you place them together. And arrangements like these are easier to view from all different angles. And similarly, here's another arrangement made of 2 arrangements. So, you know, the personality is very different between these 2 things, even though fundamentally they're sort of the same arrangement. And I really like this idea of being able to have personality shine through, even though the structure of these is basically the same. But the types of flowers that you use and sort of the more minute choices that you make really add up to a lot, whether you're using a horizontal container or a vertical one, etc. But once you sort of master these elements, Ikebana is great because there's a whole range of expression that you can do, either breaking the rules or following them and twisting them in new ways. So more recently, I guess in the last year or 2, I've started doing freestyle arrangements where you can kind of do whatever you want, but you just need to think about how the materials harmonize together and kind of work as an overall composition. This is another freestyle arrangement where you can see the materials sort of emulate the shape of the vase and kind of create a rhythm from the foreground all the way to the background. And you can start to use less traditional materials as well. Like this is an arrangement that I made that was using vegetables that I had in my kitchen. And I like this idea of Ikebana being anywhere for anyone with anything. Yeah, another freestyle arrangement that I sort of like the play of the verticality of the arrangement compared to the staunchness of the vase. But there's room for kind of more abstract ideas within Ikebana. This arrangement, I like how it simulates something that is very natural and something that you would find sort of in the wild, even though it's a man-made arrangement. And maybe those flowers don't go together in person, but I think it's cool how Ikebana allows you to sort of take from materials that don't exist in the same ecosystem or maybe the same type of or time of year, and then put them together in a way that is really thoughtful. But as I have gotten more and more practice, the arrangements have gotten a little more complicated, maybe using two vases where they can be a little, I guess, more about the composition rather than like two discrete arrangements coming together. And more recently, the lessons that I've had have been really structured around a central theme. So my 2 arrangements ago, I made something that was just focused on straight lines. And it's cool to revisit these like basic formal elements like composition, line, and color in a very intentional way, where the theme of having straight lines is a little bit abstract, but at the same time, extremely focused and literal. And I think that there's a lot of space for exploration there because there's not a lot of rules with anything else. The vase that I used in here is typically shown at a 90-degree orientation where it's a little log, but in this arrangement, in order to emphasize the straight lines, I made it as small as possible and just really pared down the branches to focus on the lines. And then my last arrangement has been the opposite of that, which is all about curved lines, which is the one that's just like out of view right there. So it's, yeah, I think the way that the curriculum is structured often contrast one thing with another, going from straight lines to curved lines. And then my next arrangement in the future, next month, will be a combination of both straight and curved lines. But like I mentioned before, it was like totally by chance that I started studying Ikebana, or I didn't know anything about it. And I just kind of messaged my teacher. But there's really like a huge amount of history surrounding Ikebana, and there's several different schools of thought around it or practice. Anything from Ikenobo, which is one of the oldest forms of Ikebana, very traditional, and as you can see, a little bit more regimented about the types of materials and the way that the arrangement should look. There's also Ohara, School of Ikebana, for example, which is really oriented around making arrangements that reflect the seasons and the passing of time. And I studied the Sogetsu School of Ikebana, which is very different. As you can see, the way that they these arrangements play with the vase and having flowers submerged, as well as just having very expressive vessels and lots of color. The Sogetsu School of Ikebana is much newer. It was founded in 1927 by Sofu Teshigahara, who is pictured on the left, and a couple of his arrangements are on the right. And Sofu Teshigahara has just been a really big inspiration to me ever since I started studying Ikebana, because he was an Ikebana master, but he was also this amazing calligrapher and sculptor and just had this varied artistic practice. And it was so cool seeing the through line in his work where this pairing of his sculpture on the left and his calligraphic work on the right just really stuck out to me, where he was thinking about creativity in sort of this more holistic way, carrying visual motifs across different mediums and just being like a very fluid, creative person. And he sort of brought this radical thinking or like holistic creativity viewpoint to Ikebana as well. When he started the Sogetsu school, he released sort of a manifesto titled The 50 Principles of Sogetsu. And there's a lot of stuff here, but I wanted to highlight a couple of things that really stuck out to me from this big list of essentially advice for flower arranging. Some of them read, be genuine, serene, and attentive at the practice. Cultivate an eye for appreciation and a hand for creation. A sense of balance is essential. This can only be achieved through constant practice. The most attentive and talented people take elaborate trouble with the preparation and the aftercare. And reading these things, they kind of shook me where I felt like Sofu Teshigahara just like had this amazing viewpoint where, you know, his advice for flower arranging was equally applicable to his calligraphic practice and his sculpture. These aren't just pieces of advice for flower arranging, but they're just advice for how to be a creative, thoughtful person. And I felt like this really crystallized his wide-ranging practice across disciplines, where he had calligraphy, sculpture, and Ikebana, and they were all just so tightly integrated together. And that sort of made me wonder, like, yeah, I've been studying Ikebana and it's cool, but could I sort of emulate what Sofu Teshigahara did? Could I maybe bring a little bit of Ikebana into other aspects of my life where, you know, right now I just have this like very meditative hobby where I hang out and play, yeah, I don't know, play around with different formal elements with flowers. But yeah, Sofu Teshigahara's practice really stuck out to me and sort of challenged me just to figure out how I could apply this to other areas. And that's where I landed on Ikebana tips for software design, which is really just based on Sofu Teshigahara's 50 Principles of Sogetsu. So I wanted to share some more tips that Sofu Teshigahara wrote and show how they could apply to a software design context. Beautiful flowers do not always make beautiful Ikebana. I think with just a slight reframing, it could totally apply to software design, where maybe instead of beautiful flowers, you think beautiful UI does not always make beautiful products. Like something might be very well polished and maybe consistent across a design system or something, but ultimately it's really about the product and whether or not that's usable and empathetic and solving a need for someone. The spirit of Ikebana applies to all periods, while the style of works may change over time. I think that this is doubly true for software. You know, you might want to say the spirit of software applies to all periods, while the styles of works may change over time. While Ikebana is a very old discipline, a lot has changed, like going from the Ikenobo school of Ikebana to the Sogetsu school is a pretty radical shift. While it's interesting to me that even though, I mean, software is a fairly nascent discipline, but a lot of the metaphors that we use in order to navigate software, like the GUI or graphic user interface, and thinking about the desktop as the primary metaphor for interacting with your computer is extremely old, like decades old. So it's kind of surprising to me that a lot of the fundamentals of software design still remain true over a longer period of time. Communicate with the flowers as you work with them. And I think that it's just so easy to just think like communicate with the designs as you work with them. I think design fundamentally is a very iterative practice, and it takes a lot of refinement, but also just time to step back, look at what you're designing and almost kind of have a conversation with it, similar to how you want to accentuate the natural beauty of plant material when you're making an Ikebana arrangement. You also want to double down on what makes a design good. And I think that takes perspective and time to really step back and evaluate that. Do not be over concerned about the result at the beginning of your studies. I think that this is just so nice to be reminded of someone who was sort of a creative genius everywhere, like telling you not to sweat it. And I think that that's especially true in design where it is so iterative. So I don't really have anything to add to this one, but I thought that that was a really nice sentiment where maybe you look at an expert and you think that they I don't know, the pressure is on to sort of compete at that level or achieve, but I think it's better just like not to pressure yourselves. The next one reads, home is not the only setting for Ikebana. Consider places more personal as well as public. And I thought that this was something that made Sogetsu Ikebana very radical, where historically it was kind of more of an aristocratic practice. And more recently, I went to an Ikebana conference, and the head of the school was saying, like, what does the Ikebana arrangement in the Toyota dealership look like? Or what does it look like in your bathroom, where you're taking this practice and just sharing it with as many or as few people as you want, rather than just having it be sort of a highbrow and accessible thing. And I think that that's like a unique challenge to software today too, where, you know, app stores are not the only setting for software. And I think there's a huge opportunity to sort of shift the mindset from designing for as much scale as possible to boutique software or an app that's only made for one person, or does it live on the web? Is it totally offline? And I think that we could benefit from taking a step back and thinking about the context that software is situated within and how it relates to its audience. And yeah, I think this next point sort of gets to that too. Complete Ikebana from a viewer's standpoint. I think you could easily say complete designs from a user's standpoint, where there are a lot of different things that go into making software. And I think especially as we continue to design for scale more than anything, I think the user sort of falls to the wayside oftentimes in those decisions. So it's nice to be reminded of that and remember that design is fundamentally about empathy and really demonstrating understanding from someone that isn't you. I think anyone can kind of design for themselves, but I think putting your ego to the side and really understanding another person and trying to address their needs in a genuine, sincere way is really difficult. Remember, there are always new, surprising themes and approaches to arranging Ikebana. Similarly, I think that there's always new, surprising themes and approaches to designing software. And that's what is so fun, even though a lot of the structure, like the GUI and the desktop metaphor, have been long-standing. I think that we're in a really exciting time where software is ubiquitous yet still nascent. And there's a lot of opportunity for challenging those underlying assumptions for how you interact with the user interface, and maybe how you think about how an unprecedented number of people may interact with something differently in different ways. But I think my favorite piece of advice from Sofu Teshigahara is Ikebana may be comparable to painting, music, or sculpture. Similarly, I feel strongly that software may be comparable to painting, music, or sculpture. I think software is just another tool for expression, and there are a lot of applied uses of software and digital products, but at the end of the day, it is something that is inherently creative, and I think has the opportunity to be so much more than a bunch of user flows or a bunch of gray rounded rectangles, but it could really be what you want it to be. And I like that, I don't know, flattening it to just be another creative discipline. So Sofu Teshigahara really integrated his viewpoint on creativity across Ikebana, calligraphy, and sculpture, and helped me rethink my relationship on how Ikebana could influence software design in my day job. But I felt like there was always kind of like this missing piece of the puzzle, where how could I kind of take this approach back into my art practice, where Ikebana inspired me to start making art again and being a little bit more accountable and having structure. But I really like thinking about how Ikebana principles could also apply to art making. And that's really come through in my more recent work, which I'd like to share a little bit about. So lately I've been making work that has been thematically inspired by Ikebana, as well as inspired by the process of creating Ikebana. So I've continued making digital work, largely digital paintings. As you can see, there's the continuation of a flower motif, and not quite as literal of a landscape as before, but when I look at this, I just think like, yeah, remember there are always new and surprising themes and approaches to arranging Ikebana, whether it's crafting a digital bouquet like this or with the types of tools that I use. So similarly to Ikebana, where things are extremely structured and constrained, and there's a set of rules for what you're supposed to do, I've sort of been applying that ideology to my art practice as well. Lately, I've been making these paintings in Keynote, which I'm presenting this talk in as well. And that has been just like this really great integration of my former day job, combining with my art practice, and then just also the sets of constraints or limitations. Creating something has really rolled this Ikebana mindset into making art. And I think that it's been nice to sort of set up the rules for myself and reduce the barriers to making new work. So I wanted to share some more of my Keynote paintings where, yeah, pairing Sofu Teshigahara advice with them. So this is, like I said before, another Keynote painting where the tools that you have are pretty limited. Essentially, these are just collages, and I use the background erase tool, and that's about it in order to construct these pieces. Some of them are more or less landscapes, like I was making before, but I think that setting these limitations and focusing the types of imagery that I've used have helped sort of develop the work and also just integrate things together, from using canvas-based tools to flowers and sort of digitally arranging these flowers now. Some of them are a little crazier, like this, where maybe lately I've sort of been interested in playing with this like idea of decentrality, where maybe there isn't a particular focal point in a composition, juxtaposed with creating more discrete objects or things that could be excerpts from a landscape or a world that I'm building. But I like the juxtaposition of sort of this landscape with this really sort of sterile computerized background. Similarly here, playing with repetition, etc. And then also abstracting the work a little bit more, where playing around with fragments and either rejiggering them together or taking them apart. And yeah, reusing things multiple times within one composition. But this idea of sort of terraforming or world building has really stuck through with the art that I've made. Sometimes in more literal ways, like here, I like to think of this as like a landmass being formed. It's also made in Keynote. But I felt like something that was really missing until very recently was this temporality that's present in Ikebana. Aside from making a three-dimensional living thing, something that really sticks out to me is watching the Ikebana take a life of its own over the course of a week, whether it's withering away or maybe falling apart a little bit. So I've started thinking about ways that I can incorporate that temporality in my digital art practice. And I've started experimenting making digital wallpapers that basically wither away over the span of 24 hours. So I've been making these dynamic wallpapers for macOS, and it's really nice because technically they are 24 images that I have bundled together in what's called an HEIC file, which is proprietary to Apple, but essentially I like to think of each of these images as one flower, and the HEIC format that contains all of them is sort of like the bouquet, or like the string that sort of holds them together. So I like thinking about how I can integrate Ikebana structurally within the art that I'm making, where, yeah, essentially I'm making digital bouquets, as well as the temporal aspect of it, where a dynamic wallpaper is something that sort of repeats itself over and over, but I like the idea of the wallpaper dissipating into the background. So that is an example of my latest wallpaper, and you can see it as my desktop with a bunch of stuff on it. And I made another wallpaper more recently, which rather than just taking things away, I am experimenting with deconstruction and maybe a more natural decomposition process throughout the course of a day. So these were taken making 3D models through my phone, and then bringing screenshots of those 3D models into Keynote and sort of tearing them apart. Working with Keynote has been great because it helps me be very iterative with what I'm making, where I can just duplicate another slide. So, you know, you can sit down and make 50 paintings in one night, which I think is really ties back to the way that I approach design as being like a highly iterative discipline where nothing is really like that precious. And then, yeah, this is an example. It's set as my desktop wallpaper as well. So I feel like, going back to sort of the beginning of this presentation, I was always having this identity crisis where I had like my product design job 9 to 5, and then I would frantically get home from work and start working on art or working on the weekends. And I think that Ikebana really has been the bridge between these different worlds to sort of up-level the way that I think about creativity and making things in a medium agnostic way. So it's been helpful to help me make sense of the way that I work and just sort of being a creative generalist. And I hope that maybe some of those tips resonate with you as well. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me tonight.
Thank you, Catherine. That's excellent. I need those wallpapers. Mine's so boring now looking at it.
Yeah,
there was one question in the chat I actually would like to ask if you're okay. Somebody asked why use Keynote when you can use the animation program, and I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to, I guess, why Keynote is your chosen, besides the fact that you've worked on it, I guess, in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I am very familiar with Keynote, obviously, but for me, it was key to think about ways to reduce barriers to making stuff. And I originally started playing around with Keynote as a format back in 2016, where I was like bedridden. I had this horrible sinus infection and I couldn't get out of bed, and I was just so bored. So I was playing around on my phone and I was like, wow, I have Keynote on my phone. Maybe I'll just mess around with this. And I think I'm someone who is easily demotivated and maybe a little bit lazy inherently. So the idea of having an app that's with me anytime, anywhere, just gives me less excuses, I guess.
That's a totally valid reason. I definitely understand. Looks like a couple other questions come in. What are some of your favorite flowers and branches that you like to work with?
I try to work with different materials every time I make something, largely because I want to gain a better understanding of plants generally, and different plants have different characteristics where some might have very malleable stems where you can bend them without breaking, and some are more delicate. And also the lifespan of a flower factors into an arrangement as well, where if you know that you have class the next day, it's okay if something wilts, but if you buy your flowers like a week out, you really need something that's a little hardier. So I always try to challenge myself to work with at least one material that I haven't worked with before. And this is actually vines from the kiwi plant, which I've never worked with before, but that was like really fun to try to understand that a little bit. And it's been going strong for like 2 weeks. They aren't gross yet.
Great. And then one more question from Michael, who's on our team here in Pittsburgh. Can you speak a little bit more to the expression in software? It feels like I'm always pursuing functionality with affordances and common elements. The most expression I can find is the button color. I think that's a common frustration.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I, I think the software industry is sort of ripe for expression in that way because we've reached an apex, I think, where everyone is familiar with a lot of software conventions where maybe that wasn't the case 5 or especially 10 years ago. And I think it's easy to make something that's very understandable, but it's hard to make something that is delightful or interesting or novel. And there's a number of reasons for that. I mean, I feel like my answer is a little bit of a cop-out, but I think that we've reached a place organizationally where people are comfortable trying to minimize, get the most bang for your buck in terms of implementation. So I think that it's hard because you can't just make something that's better. You have to make something that's 10 times better to justify the amount of extra engineering work that's going to be built in it. So I don't know if I have an answer for you, but I definitely say you are not alone. And I think that good and novel and interesting design is getting more and more recognized in the industry for being a key differentiator in the market, as well as just like functionally.
Great, thank you. Well, I think that's all we have today, Catherine. Thank you so much. A beautiful presentation. We really appreciate your time tonight, and thanks everyone for joining. I've just dropped a link in the chat. That's a link to our website, ixdapgh.org, where you can keep up with our future events, as well as sign up for our email list if you want to really get them, first thing. And then there is also a link there to apply to be one of the co-leaders here in Pittsburgh. So if you're local and you're interested in joining our team, feel free to check out that application. There's information about the role there as well. And with that, I guess have a great night, everyone. Thank you again, Catherine. This has been great.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yep. Bye, everyone.